The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 14th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And your host, who has invited both of you, may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, or your brothers, or your relatives, or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of our Lord. Praise to you. Please be seated. So, is there more to this story than just good social advice? It actually sounds like this parable fits nicely into a random list of Midwestern socially polite behaviors. Things my grandma would say when she was alive. Don't chew with your mouth open. Don't interrupt people when they're talking. Don't sit at a table reserved for someone else. Who do you think you are anyway? Oh, and be a good grandson and invite the Jensen boy to sit with you at lunch. I know he's a bit off, but his parents are nice, and it's the right thing to do. When I hear this story as some kind of good social and moral advice, I want to respond in the same way I did to my grandma when she gave me good social and moral advice. Okay, Grandma. Okay, Jesus, you've certainly given me a lot to think about. It was good visiting with you this week. I'll see you next week. Is that what this is? Good advice to avoid public embarrassment? And then a suggestion that really won't be taken seriously, to be nice to all the boys and girls who you don't socialize with because it's the right thing to do? Not really. Jesus' story actually has an edge to it that might be lost due to culture. We don't live in the same honor and shame society that Jesus did. The first century world of ancient Palestine was very much a stratified culture where there was a place for everyone, and everyone had his or her place. In this kind of society, status was absolutely everything, and the way that you gained status was through a system of mutual patronage. You did people favors, and they in turn did you favors when you needed it. So it actually is good advice not to overreach in terms of your social status. It would be absolutely mortifying in that culture to have your host move you to a lower place, and incredibly empowering to have your host move you to a better seat. In this case, what Jesus is saying is, well, it made sense and would likely have been followed. If not from a sense of humility, well then from a sense of practical wisdom. But then Jesus just keeps talking. When he goes on to advise his host, mind you, in a time and place where respect for your host is absolutely everything, not to invite those people to dinner who could repay him in any way, but instead to invite the undesirables. well, then Jesus' advice suddenly seems odd, crazy, borderline offensive. In a world where the exchange of mutual obligations was not just expected, it was actually the cultural norm. It made common sense. Who in their right mind would squander their status and their privilege to those who can offer nothing in return? It's absurd. I mean, it's just stupid, which is probably how you know it's of God. So I was trying to think of something that I can compare this to, because again, cultural differences, hard to connect sometimes, to get the full effect of what Jesus is saying. And it came to me during orientation at Sauk Rapids Middle School for our oldest daughter. We were going from classroom to classroom, and we passed by the space where students eat lunch. And it's what you would probably imagine, a large open space where round tables can easily be set up. It made me think back to my high school lunchroom and the fact that lunchrooms have not changed all that much in the last 20 years. So, in order to help you get some kind of sense of this, here is a poorly created visual aid to help you envision. A large room, round tables that seat about 8, about 20 or 30 tables in general. Pretty simple, right? Okay, now I want you to think about this. How does a lunchroom work? Do you simply get your food and pick anywhere to sit, and people you don't know will smile at you and say things like, "Hi, I don't know you, but I would like to get to know you. Why don't you sit here with me and we'll have a nice chat together?" Is that how lunchrooms work at school? Absolutely not. Only in the Andy Griffith Show or some other 1950s romanticized community do lunchrooms work like that. No. So the bottom right corner of my high school lunchroom is where the football, basketball, wrestling, dance, and cheerleading teams sat. If you were not part of that peer group, you did not sit there. Next to them were the kids who were in band, choir, drama, generally smart academic types. If you were not in that crowd, you did not sit there. For simplicity's sake, we can call the rest of the tables other groups. There was a country western group, a wannabe street gang group, a half dozen other groups. Generally speaking, groups did not mix. Where you sat determined a great deal what people assumed about you. Where you sat determined if you would ever be popular or not. Where you sat determined where you would spend your Friday nights. Where you sat determined your GPA somewhat. The absolute worst, though, is if you did not belong to any group, if you had to eat by yourself. There is a shame that comes from not belonging, and it's very real, and it's awful. So I want you to do this. Imagine that you are a new student. You don't know anybody. Imagine your first day of school. You find yourself looking out over a mass of people eating lunch. You know what's at stake. Where do you go? What do you do? Where do you even start? What if you tried to sit somewhere to find that spot was not for you? Or let's change the scenario. So imagine this. You do have a group. You do have friends. You've been a part of the community for a long time, and one day you notice someone who is new, or you notice someone who doesn't fit into any of these table groups. What do? Do you sacrifice your status with your peers? Do you risk committing social suicide by walking away from your peer group to sit with another? Or worse yet, do you open yourself up to criticism and ridicule by inviting somebody who does not fit within your group to join you for lunch? I mean, things do not change that much as people get older. The world is a high school lunchroom. It really is. But it looks differently depending on your context. So if you're currently in the workforce, think about your place of employment. How does it operate? Who are those left behind? Who are those that are often minimized, taken advantage of, or simply not considered? Who doesn't have a place at the table? Or think about your extended family system. Do you have family members by the nature of where they live, the decisions that they have made, the things that they have said, the lifestyle that they have chosen that make it hard, if not impossible, for them to relate to your family and to be included in family gatherings? Who doesn't have a place at your table in your family? We can ask the same thing about our church. That'd be a really good question to ask. Our community, really any organization, who doesn't have a place at the table? As I was thinking about this, I kept coming back to a question that is at the heart of this gospel reading. It's begging to be asked. Why would anybody in their right mind even consider doing what Jesus shamelessly implores his host to do, to invite in those who don't fit into your school peer group, into your circle of work friends, into your family gatherings, into your church? If my life is good, if my life is comfortable, if I am happy, why do it? Why risk the social shame and the potential consequences? Showing up at the family reunion with Uncle Bob after what he did is going to cause problems. If I bring him, it will not benefit me. Why do it? Because, as my grandma would say, it's the right thing to do? Well, that doesn't fly anymore. As I was thinking about this, I realized not only is that a selfish question, but it's also a privileged question. To ask it means that I don't have to deal with being on the outside. Why do it? And why is it central to Jesus' mission? Because it is hell on the outside. Because living with the shame of not belonging is absolutely unbearable. It takes life from us. It is not God's dream for creation. Jesus comes to Jerusalem not just to challenge the kingdom of the world, not just to reform it, not just to make it better. He comes to overthrow it, to put before us an entirely different way of being, a whole new way of relating to each other. So pretty much everything that Jesus says about caring for each other with no regard for status or repayment, well, that makes absolutely no sense in light of the values of his day and maybe even ours. Following in the way of Jesus is about a different way of being and doing, a way of being and doing based on mutual love rather than mutual obligation. In the way of Jesus, we find that the only things of value that you can keep are those things that you give away, even your social status. God cares about my life, about your lives, but also about the lives of those who have no place at the table. If you've ever been a student with nowhere to sit and you were welcomed in by another, if you have ever been a family member distanced and then found reconciliation, if you've ever believed that you just don't fit in for whatever reason, only to be accepted as you are, for who you are, then you have experienced the kind of love that God dreams for all of creation, and it's what we're called to do as we follow in the way of Jesus. And I get how impossible this can be. And yet every time we gather for worship, we practice it. That's part of why we gather for worship, not just to hear, but to practice living this life that God dreams for creation. So in this congregation, when we celebrate the love, grace, and mercy of God through communion, we remember that Jesus ate with absolutely everyone, that everyone was welcome at the table. And practicing this every time as people from this congregation come forward and no one is asked to stay seated, better helps us, or it prepares us to do this then in our daily lives, in our families, in our places of work. So after leaving this place today, pay attention. Begin to see the world through the eyes of Christ. Begin to see those who are not present at your tables in life, whatever your tables are. Begin to experience God's love that comes as we share that love with our neighbors in a variety of ordinary ways. This is the good news that we hear today. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.